I used to think my mother knew everything about my childhood. She was there, after all. In the house. In the rooms. In the background of every memory I have from growing up. I assumed that whatever happened to me, she had either seen it or chosen not to see it. And for a long time, I blamed her for both. What I didn't understand was that there were entire parts of my life she had never been allowed to know. The discovery didn't happen during a dramatic confrontation or a moment of suspicion. It started with something ordinary. A leak in the ceiling of our old family house. The house had been mostly empty for years. My parents were separated by then, living in different places, pretending they were still on polite terms for the sake of appearances. My childhood bedroom had become a storage space. Boxes stacked on boxes. Old furniture covered in sheets. Things nobody wanted to deal with yet. When the ceiling started leaking after heavy rain, my mother decided to finally clean out the upstairs rooms. She said it casually on the phone, like it was just another chore. I didn't think much of it. That house was full of memories I'd already learned how to keep at a distance. A few days later, she called me again. Her voice was different. She didn't sound angry. Or sad. She sounded confused. She asked me if I remembered going to the hospital a lot when I was younger. I said yes. Of course I did. I remembered doctors' offices, waiting rooms, fluorescent lights. I remembered being examined, measured, asked questions I didn't fully understand. I remembered being told to sit still, to behave, to answer politely. What I didn't remember was why. My mother said she'd found a box hidden behind an old wardrobe in what used to be my room. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't with the other paperwork. It looked like it had been deliberately tucked away, pushed back as far as it could go. Inside were medical records. Not a few pages. Not a single folder. Years of them. Reports. Evaluations. Notes from doctors, therapists, social workers. Dates that stretched across my entire childhood. Ages written in neat handwriting. Observations about my behavior. My body. My mental state. My mother told me she sat on the floor and started reading them one by one. At first, she thought they belonged to someone else. The descriptions didn't match the version of my childhood she carried in her head. They described a child who was anxious, withdrawn, hypervigilant. A child with unexplained injuries. A child who showed signs of distress that no one could, or would, fully explain. There were notes about missed follow-ups. About concerns raised and then dropped. About recommendations that were never acted on. There were phrases like, environmental factors, and, home situation unclear. There were questions written in the margins. My mother said the longer she read, the harder it became to breathe. She kept stopping, standing up, walking around the room like she needed physical distance from what was on the pages. Then she'd sit back down and keep reading, like she was afraid that if she stopped, the truth would disappear again. At some point, she realized something that made her hands start shaking. She had never seen any of this before. These records weren't addressed to her. They weren't copied to her. Some of them explicitly listed her as not present. They were addressed to my father. My parents had been married then. Living in the same house. Raising me together, at least on the surface. And yet there was an entire paper trail documenting concerns about my safety that had never reached her. She told me she kept flipping through the pages, looking for something that would reassure her. Something that would say the concerns were resolved. That everything was fine. That it had been a misunderstanding. But instead, she found a pattern. Concerns raised. Investigations opened. Then silence. Again and again. There were records from school counselors noting changes in my behavior. Reports from doctors noting inconsistencies in explanations. Observations that suggested I was afraid to speak freely when certain people were present. And then there were gaps. Months. Sometimes years. No follow-up. No closure. My mother told me she felt sick when she realized what those gaps likely meant. That someone, somewhere, had decided not to push further. Not to ask harder questions. Not to disrupt a family that looked functional enough from the outside. She said she kept whispering, "I was there." How could I not know? I didn't know how to answer her. Because I had spent my entire adult life assuming she did know. Assuming she had seen the signs and chosen comfort over confrontation. Assuming her silence had been a choice. Hearing her cry on the phone, reading words she'd never seen before, forced me to confront a different kind of horror. What if she hadn't known because she'd been kept from knowing? What if my safety had been discussed in rooms she was never invited into? As she read more, my mother started noticing details that made everything worse. Notes indicating appointments scheduled when she was at work. Conversations documented with only one parent present. Decisions made without consulting both. She realized that someone had controlled the narrative. That information about my condition, my fear, my vulnerability, had been filtered before it ever reached her. By the time she finished reading, she said she felt like she was standing in a stranger's life. Not mine. Hers. A version of motherhood where she had failed without ever being given the chance to succeed. She asked me if I remembered any of it. I told her the truth. I remembered being afraid, but not of what. I remembered feeling watched, but not protected. I remembered learning very early what not to say. I remembered knowing that certain things were normal in our house, even if they felt wrong in my body. What I didn't remember was anyone asking me directly if I was safe. The records showed that people had suspected. They had noticed. They had written careful, cautious language about risk and concern. And then they had let it go. My mother kept apologizing. Over and over. Saying she should have seen it. Should have fought harder. Should have known. Listening to her, I felt something complicated settle in my chest. Anger, yes. Grief, definitely. But also a cold realization that the system had failed long before either of us understood what was happening. The truth wasn't just that my mother hadn't protected me. It was that multiple adults had quietly agreed not to look too closely. And someone had made sure the one person who might have fought didn't have all the information. When we hung up, I sat alone for a long time, thinking about those papers sitting in a box for years. About how close they'd come to being thrown away without ever being read. About how many versions of my life existed on paper that never translated into action. About how safety isn't just about love or intention, but about access to the truth. And for the first time, I understood something that changed the way I saw my past forever. I hadn't just grown up unsafe. I had grown up documented. Questioned. Noticed. And then quietly abandoned anyway. My mother didn't sleep that night. She told me later that every time she closed her eyes, she saw lines of text from the records floating in the dark. Dates. Ages. Clinical phrases that suddenly felt brutal in their neutrality. Words like concern and monitor that now sounded like excuses. The next morning, she went back to the house alone. She said she needed to see if there was anything else. Anything she'd missed. She didn't tell my father she was going. She didn't ask permission. For the first time in years, she moved through that house as if it belonged to her again. She started in my old room. The wardrobe where the box had been hidden was heavy, awkward to move. She said it took effort, the kind that makes your back ache and your breath short. When she pulled it away from the wall, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, faint scratches on the floor behind it, like it had been shifted back and forth more than once. As if someone had gone to the trouble of hiding and rehiding what was back there. Behind the wardrobe, taped to the wall, were more papers. Not medical records this time. Correspondence. Letters from schools. Notices from social services. Requests for meetings. Follow-ups that had never been followed through on. Some had been opened. Some hadn't. All of them had been addressed to my father. None to her. She sat on the floor again, her back against the wall, surrounded by evidence of a parallel version of my childhood she had never been part of. She said that was when the guilt stopped feeling abstract and started feeling physical. Like a weight pressing down on her chest. Because even if she hadn't known everything, she had trusted the wrong person. She had assumed that silence meant things were fine. That no news was good news. That if something was wrong, she would be told. That assumption had cost me years of safety. When she confronted my father later that week, he didn't deny hiding the records. He minimized them. He said the doctors were overreacting. That institutions always exaggerated. That he didn't want to cause trouble or blow things out of proportion. He said he was protecting the family. When she asked why she hadn't been informed, he said he didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. That answer broke something in her. Because protecting the family had meant protecting himself. Protecting appearances. Protecting control. And it had worked. For years. My mother told me she realized in that moment that her blindness hadn't just been accidental. It had been engineered. She had been kept busy, reassured, redirected. While decisions about my body and mind were being made without her, she had been allowed to believe she was an equal parent. She wasn't. Neither was I a child anyone was truly listening to. What haunts her the most, she said, isn't the idea that she failed me. It's the idea that people noticed something was wrong and still let it continue because intervening would have been inconvenient. Teachers. Doctors. Administrators. People who documented concerns carefully and then moved on. Because I was quiet. Because I wasn't disruptive. Because I adapted. I was the kind of child systems fail easily. Not dramatic enough to demand action. Not visible enough to save. When my mother asked me if I wanted to pursue answers now, legal ones, formal ones, I surprised both of us by saying no. Not because I didn't care. But because I was tired. Tired of having my pain turned into paperwork. Tired of reliving things through official channels that had already decided, once, that I wasn't worth the trouble. What I wanted instead was acknowledgement. And in a strange, painful way, that box gave me something I'd never had before. Proof. Proof that what I felt as a child wasn't imagined. Proof that my fear had been visible, even if it wasn't acted on. Proof that I hadn't been weak or dramatic or broken. I had been unsafe. And someone had known. My relationship with my mother changed after that. Not into something simple or easy. There is grief there that can't be undone. Years we can't get back. But there is also honesty now. A shared understanding of what was taken from both of us in different ways. She stopped apologizing eventually. Not because she wasn't sorry, but because we both understood that some apologies are too small for the damage they're meant to address. What mattered more was that she stopped defending the past. She stopped saying things like, "We did our best," or "We didn't know any better." Instead, she says, "You deserved better." That sentence still makes my throat tighten when I hear it. Sometimes I think about how close those records came to being lost forever. Thrown away during a cleanup. Forgotten. Buried with the rest of the past. And I think about how many people never get even this much confirmation. How many grow up doubting their own memories because there is no paper trail, no box in the back of a closet, no proof waiting to be found. I don't feel closure. But I do feel clarity. I know now that my childhood wasn't confusing because I was confused. It was confusing because the truth was hidden. And realizing that didn't fix everything. But it finally allowed me to stop wondering whether I had imagined the danger. I hadn't. I had lived in it. And the unthinkable part wasn't just what happened to me. It was how many chances there were to stop it, and how quietly they were ignored.